Thanks, ladies and gentlemen, and good morning. When I was first phoned by Colin, he said, "Can you talk about the Territorials 1915?" And I said, "How long?" And he said, 40 minutes. And the first reaction was, no, you can't do it in 40 minutes, but I'm going to try. It means it's such a vast topic that I'm not going to talk about the home forces at all, second, third lines. They're going to have to go. I'm not going to talk about the sensitive issues of the conversion of pioneers to the amalgamation of territorial battalions, or about the controversial home service or imperial service options and those sorts of things. What I'm going to concentrate upon, and I know, and in this case I'm going to take refuge in it, it's the sense that it's the Western Front Association. I know we can be very elastic in some of our topics and so on, but I'm going to stick to the Western Front. I'm going to hardly mention Gallipoli. I will not mention the Territorials in India, and I will not even give you a photo, a PowerPoint, because you've seen all the rare photos. There aren't that many from 1915 anyway that are in the public domain. So we could spend our time looking at photos. We're not going to do that. What I'm going to talk about is simply 4 topics, and that will be the arrival of the Territorials and the Territorial Divisions and their period of trench acclimatisation in 1915, the use of the infantry, and I'm afraid it is going to be very infantry-centric. Apologies to those who want to hear about the field ambulances and the engineers and the artillery and so on. And then a conclusion, wind it up with that. I've got 40 minutes. I'm going to try and do it this way. So we're off. If you think about the number of TF units in France by February 1915, it amounts to about 39 battalions. There were 12 field companies and 10 field ambulances. Now, if you think of 39 battalions, that's 3 1/3 divisions of infantry, which meant that the entire BEF, the Territorials, constituted about 24% of all infantry was there in February. That's before any of the territorial divisions themselves arrived. Now, for those who went to France early, those battalions, they had to try and hone the skills that had begun to be sharpened in the post-mobilization training process. But much to their disgust, as a couple of them said, many of them were, such as the 6th Welsh and 12th London, were kept on lines of communication. They were split up like 5 Border were, so they couldn't really do a great deal of training. The original practice was that they would go to St Omer, GHQ, and they would stay there for a period. Well, the first 16 battalions stayed there for 20-odd days. That was the average. When they were there, they were wiring, practicing musketry. Most of them had only just been actually issued with their weapons as they were just about boarding the vessels to France. The COs simply said about this time that it was a waste of time. It was dissipated energy which they could have been used far better. The initial policy of sending them to St Omer, first of all, was abandoned in February 1915, and from that time on, battalions were sent directly to their host divisions or corps. Now, Sir John French did notice what he called the great difference in the comparative standard of the different territorial battalions as they arrived. He singled out 8 Royal Scots and Queen's Westminsters. He said they were so far advanced that he allowed them, or they were sent, to the front after a period of only 6 or 9 days. When the West Lancashire Division arrived, elements of the West Lancashire Division, because of course it had been split up, the time between disembarkation and going to the front dropped substantially, which is rather strange because Hamilton, who had GOC, CNC, I should say, home forces, had been very concerned about the West Lancashire. He said it was about 20% behind the rest of the other divisions in its efficiency. So the fact that some of those West Lancs battalions went forward very quickly is a little bit strange in that sense. The period of trench acclimatisation, the early practice was you would have one company in the trenches being instructed, the other 3 companies would be in the rear doing digging, carrying parties and that sort of thing. for their early use. Now, Hamilton had consistently lauded, all through the autumn of 1914, he'd lauded the growing skills of his Territorials. And he said that they shouldn't, when they are sent abroad, he said they shouldn't simply be put on lines of communication. He said they're better than that, they're worth far more than that. And he criticised what he called, when the London Scots, he said they were kept burying corpses for far too long, and their efficiency was reduced as a consequence. He praised the Welsh division. He said that was wonderful. He called the Highland Division magnificent, but did accept that the officers of the Highland Division were not as good as they should be, and he said the sons of the Laird is less capable of quick decision-making than the Birmingham or Manchester solicitor. You might believe that, you might not. Bob? Despite what Hamilton and French might have thought about the progress, though, there were some more doubts, or widespread doubts, particularly at GOC, Home and Reserve Forces, about the quality that was being sent overseas. They produced a report in January 15, which was circulated to all home training areas as well as GOCs over in France. There were the usual complaints, as you might expect, about the overall lax discipline, which the TF had been criticised for since its formation in 1908. There were criticism about the fact they don't do guard duties properly. But perhaps the most telling of the criticisms was that they hadn't done nearly enough practice in trench digging and dugout construction by the time they'd arrived in France. So if we think of that criticism, and then from home, what about that which was pertaining when they were actually in France? Now, GHQ wanted the different corps there to report on how they were going to train their territorial divisions once they started arriving. And so they sent down the chain of command to corps, who then sent it down to the divisional GOCs, who were going to be responsible for doing the initial training. There were various schemes put forward, but in the end, it was a fairly similar practice across 3 or 4 divisions that were used initially. The GOC brigades then had to report up to division, who then reported up to corps as to what they thought of the Territorials once they'd had their initial period over in France. There's the usual criticism, as again you'd expect, about the lack of leadership and knowledge amongst NCOs, also about the tender age that many of the Territorials were. There were many 17-year-olds who were going over. But the general consensus was that their previous training in the UK had been excellent or good. And they praised, for example, one of the first division to undergo this process was the North Midland. And it was 4 and 6 divisions who had initially instructed them. And the brigade commanders there praised the North Midlanders for their bearing, their keenness, their march discipline, and their intelligence. And there were similar reports for 2nd London when that was undergoing its training as well. It was attached to 2nd Div, and the hosting brigade and battalion commanders described them as intelligent and keen. But again, there was a fair amount of criticism about the quality of the TF officers. So there was if you like, an inevitable predictability in the regulars' assessment of the TF capabilities. But what is evident, I should say, is that the regulars were surprised by the keenness and the willingness that the TF soldiers were showing. Even the Guards Brigade, who had the post office rifles under instruction, gave them nothing but praise. 2nd Div GOC said they've done very well, but they might have had a little bit more training before they came out, and it was pointed out to him. He said, well, look, some of the battalions you've had under your command here were dispersed all over southern England for several months, guarding the railways and vulnerable points. So they hadn't been able to do mostly any company training, let alone battalion training, before they were suddenly shipped out to you. The Highland Division, which landed in May, and within 15 days of its arrival, it had taken over trenches, which had only just been won by 2nd Division. They'd been virtually destroyed anyway, these trenches. So the Highlanders had to go in, reconstruct, rebuild the trenches. This is their first initiation. There's scores, if not hundreds, of dead lying out in no man's land in front of them as well. It was a very nasty beginning or initial experience for these troops. To expect them to have done what they did was probably a little bit too much, and they did get criticised in the end for their performance at that battle. But it was going to be 3 months before the division was going to be taken out of the line and allowed to do what its historian later described as its apprenticeship. In other words, it was only then that it was given time to reflect and hone its skills. The regimental histories frequently refer to what the historian of Five Black Watch, for instance, described as the camaraderie and good fellowship between the regulars and territorials who were being instructed. It's further improved, as you can probably imagine. I'm sure you've heard of, there were wagon loads of parcels which began arriving for the territorials from many of their county associations, and for the more elite battalions from their own parents. These wagon loads of food and parcels and good knows what were shared with the regulars, so the relationship became that much closer and that much better. They were taught the basic skills of how to sort of brew tea in an empty bully beef can, while the regulars then had the enjoyment of the stuff sent from home. The relationship, I think, was probably further enhanced if the instructing regiment or battalion, I should say, was doing one of its own territorials. For example, the Middlesex. Excuse me. 2nd Middlesex instructed 7 Middlesex, and they described it as a bitter blow when the two battalions were finally separated because they'd got on so well. But the regulars do say, time and time again, that how impressed they were, again, with the territorials' keenness and willingness to learn. But, on the other hand, if you believe anything that Robert Graves said in Goodbye to All That, he talks, Graves has a Captain Dunn, the MO of the Royal Welsh. He's describing a TF battalion attached to 22 Brigade, and they described it simply as hopeless. And he says, as the result of doing nothing to improve the trenches, lost half their men from frostbite and rheumatism. The territorials allegedly left food lying around, which encouraged the rats, made a complete hash of constructing a sniper's nest, and left the place looking like a sewage farm, so says Dunn. All in all, Dunn said, the territorials were awful swine. There's a similar account of a chap in 1 Royal Scots. He says, the beginning of the trouble was the arrival in the district of a territorial brigade. To them we had to hand over our most beautiful trench on which we had done so much work. The battalion that relieved us was DLI, and a dirtier, untidier, more inefficient lot it has never been my fortune to meet. Instead of taking an interest in getting the men properly settled into the trench, the officers immediately gathered together and squabbled as to what dugouts would be occupied by which subaltern. The idea of leaving our spotless trench in the hands of such barbaros is very disgusting, he said. By the time the summer lull of 15 comes about, it gives the War Office, those slightly quieter few months, the opportunity to think about reposting some of those battalions which had come over, as well as the field companies and ambulances actually as well, that had come over independently of their division. Now, the new armies were beginning to arrive in France, so this opportunity now arose. But it also gave them, the War Office, the opportunity to think, well, if every division now is to have a pioneer division, where are we going to find them from? Let's use the territorials, because they're so weakened, we've deliberately kept their manpower, their drafts down to an absolute minimum, and there's not going to create too much of a fuss, so we'll use them. It also gave the opportunity, of course, for the War Office to get rid from the regular divisions, the territorials, who worked under different terms of service. And that caused them sometimes problems as to who could go where and when. That whole question of drafting we can't really go into today. Now, as far as the infantry was concerned, they were very resentful about the fact that the new army divisions were arriving in 1915 armed with Shortley Enfields, 18-pounders, 4.5 Hows. whereas they still had the old Longley Enfields, the obsolete 15-pounders and the obsolete 5-inch. And this just added grist to the mill as far as the Territorials were concerned, that they weren't appreciated, and it's the new armies which were the favoured bunch. With whatever weapon they were armed with, when they arrived at these individual battalions we're still talking about, when they arrived at their regular ones, they were put on to trench engineering, essentially. And the prevailing attitude of brigade and divisional commanders was that they wanted the regular troops to do the fighting. The TF units would do what they could to relieve the regulars of basic digging, wiring, fatigue parties and so on. And in time, certainly they would be able to take over their own spots of trenches or their own line. And this would be able to add to the sort of the usual roulement of the battalions in the line. But for the moment, they were considered to be additional labour rather than additional fighting troops. There were, of course, exceptions, if you think about the London Scots, but on Messines Ridge, but these exceptions came in defensive battles rather than offensive. The London Scots, were thought to have performed very well. Sir John French praised them as given, as he said, a glorious lead and example to all other territorial troops. But he was concerned that the Territorials as a whole, when they suffered losses like the London Scots had, that morale of the battalion would plummet. He thought they didn't have the sort of the integral bond cohesion that a regular battalion would have. Those battalions which arrived after the Scottish weren't put to the same test quite as early. They were not selected as assault troops, but were usually instructed in these early engagements to remain in the trenches, to occupy the front line once it had been evacuated by the attacking brigades. There are, again, odd examples. There's the example of one company of 4 Suffolk who helped clear Givenchy with 1 Manchester. And it was described afterwards rather dramatically, I think, as one of the most brilliant feats of the war. But it was from a somewhat biased writer, that one. In the set-piece battles, well, of course, there weren't very many during the first winter because it was the creation of the trench system and so on. But come Neuve-Chapelle, in the 4 divisions which were involved at Neuve-Chapelle had 10 territorial battalions attached to them. They were only given supporting roles. And it's a similar story at Aubers in May, where, for example, all 3 TF battalions in 1 div were used initially only in a supporting role. 9 Kings, for example, was tasked to hold the British front line in case of a German counterattack. 4 Welsh Fusiliers were supposed to follow 3 Brigade as support, but didn't get further than their own trenches. And 5 Sussex were also supposed to be there in support, but they broke, the discipline broke, and they essentially just surged over with the leading waves, completely disobeying orders. As it said, the official history says they swarmed over the top, but only added later to what became simply a disaster, as it was called. I think the only time that a TF battalion was used as an assault leading wave was actually the Kensingtons, when they were tasked to take 2 craters on the very flank. They were about the only troops that day as well, actually, to take the position. They couldn't hold it because troops either side, the usual tale, of course, fell back, and they lost over 400 men as a consequence. At Festubert, those battalions which were still attached to the regular divs were allocated a slightly more inclusive role than they had been earlier on. 7 Kings of 2 div, for instance, was in the leading wave. 4 Cameron Highlanders got into the German trenches but then had to withdraw. And then 8 Royal Scots spent most of the battle garrisoning trenches, but in the words of their historian, he says they suffered all the evils without experiencing any of the pleasures of war, which has always struck me as a rather strange thing to write. But anyway, 47th, i.e. 2nd London, was involved largely in the latter stages of that battle. There was 1 brigade, 142, which did an attack. They'd practiced it, In the rear, they had two leading battalions which swept over no man's land into the German trenches, but then the usual story of 1915 happened again. The divisional artillery could do nothing really about breaking up the German counterattacks or doing anything about some German batteries which were then catching the Londoners in enfilade, because there was no communication between two divisions. Trying to get your own artillery to do something was difficult enough, but trying to get someone else's artillery to do something for you was almost impossible in 15. Nevertheless, Monroe, Corps Commander, who had actually been a GOC of 2nd London, thought it was magnificent, and he congratulated his gallant old comrades of the brigade. And Barter, the GOC div, said he described the attack as worthy of veteran regular troops. But the barrage was inadequate because the Territorials' guns were inadequate, basically. And until they were armed with better weapons, better communications, and so on, then the old story would always happen. 51 Div, or the Highland, was selected to take part in another of the attempts to divert German attention away from French assaults further to the south. But Rawlinson had very little faith in the Highlanders. He thought that they were a very poor division when it arrived. He criticised very quickly its staff work. I'll come back to that in a little while. It's not clear why he thought really that the staff work was so bad, but excuse me, General Maxey later on, with a good degree of hindsight, he recalled that in 1915 he said the division had been ill-organised and unsoldier-like. But in fact, the Highland Division did better than the 7th Div and the Canadian Div either side of it during that attack, but again had to withdraw. Rawlinson, despite that, remained unhappy with the quality of the division. He complained that there were too few gentlemen amongst their officers. Now, to Rawlinson, that was an important qualification, I suppose. The COs, the two ICs, might not have been gentlemen in Rawlinson's sort of interpretation of it, and they might not have been as well trained as an au fait with the tactics and so on required of them, command and leadership. But, excuse me, what is clear is that the troops fought well under their junior officers. The problem was, as always, if your junior officer falls, if your platoon or company commander goes down, then it's down to the NCOs. But here again was the constant criticism of territorial NCOs. They lacked initiative, they lacked command and the means of commanding, so troops usually just stayed where they were, waited for new orders to come, which of course, in Clausewitz's fog and frictions of war, hardly ever did arrive. So why weren't they used in these battles earlier on? I think the GOCs were reluctant to use them because there would have been little operational purpose if they did in diverting the Territorials from their more important task in 1915, the first half of 15 in particular, of labouring. If you tried to take them away, or if you did take them away from their role essentially as pioneers and supporting troops to become the supported component, it would have been a waste of labour as far as the GOCs were concerned. It was thought there were still sufficient regulars and reservists with the adequate skills to undertake these limited assaults. They preferred to use what they had, also sufficient experience to stiffen the resolve, if you like, of the drafts that were now coming in large numbers to the regular battalions. But there was also the question of status and prestige. There's no doubt that the old army appreciated the Territorials being there because it eased their lot considerably, but the Territorials had to remember their place in the army's hierarchy. They were okay for defence, they were okay for labouring, they were okay for support. But tradition and status, I think, does play a large role in this. Attacks should be made by professional soldiers, not by auxiliary volunteers, which is still what is the way that the army, the regular army, had always looked upon the volunteers and then the Territorials from 1908. In some ways, of course, it's fortunate because it meant that the Territorials didn't lose as many in the casualty lists as perhaps the regulars did. But rather than, when we're coming to Second E, the strange thing is, rather than use the 4 territorial divisions which are already in France and have been for most of them for about 2 months, what's thrown in to Second E is the 50th Northumbrian, which is only just arriving. Why don't they shuffle the divisions around a bit? Why use this one, which has had no time for any trench acclimatisation whatsoever, throw it in piecemeal, battalion by battalion, essentially, rather than using those which do have some experience. That, again, I think is the I have to say this word, exigency, close enough, of war. In Second E, it was defensive. There wasn't the opportunity for commanders to decide who should do what attack, which would be the best battalion to do it. It was all hands to the pump. If a battalion was out at reserve, it wasn't because it was a territorial battalion, it was one that had just been able to be drawn out the line for a few hours rest before it was put in again. It was a matter of who's available, let's do it. So there wasn't that option of deciding whether it should be TF or not. It's also difficult to know how the 50th Division actually did, i.e. was it successful, because its own divisional HQ didn't know where its troops were. The DHQ was kept in the rear, but the field ambulances and a lot of the engineers weren't anywhere near the actual fighting. The battalions were attached to other brigades of the regulars and, as I say, used up piecemeal. The official history later described the tasks set to the Northumberland Brigade as impossible and its losses as devastating. But it did show, or the whole battalions within the division, the Green Howards, the East Yorks, DLI and so on, thought that they had fought well, they'd put in a sound performance, and the official history again says these very fine troops were thought to have done much to hearten the other troops. There's a little footnote as well in the OH about the gas, because the DLO miners were thought to be more used to gas than anybody else was, so the fact that they didn't bother too much about whether the Germans were pumping out the gas or not was thought to encourage some of the regulars who, of course, had never experienced it. But what is significant, I think, is the manner in which the troops continue to fight, even though most of their original officers had gone. In early May, 61 officers arrived as replacements, and then another 24 arrived about 3 days later into the Northumbrian Division. So there's 85 new junior officers, and the troops have still got to continue fighting with people that they've never met. These are officers who are only being commissioned from their second line, and they're thrown straight into the battle as well. So I think the oft-derided discipline of the Territorials, its alleged dubious skills, and its often misunderstood morale, and its supposed very doubtful cohesion, probably all helped to compensate for the shortage of men, not only in Northumbrian Division, but in other divisions and battalions as well. At Lewes, TF battalions remained attached to regular divisions for the initial stages of Lewes. 4 Black Watch did lead a diversionary attack of the Bailey Brigade towards Obers, that was. 1 Hertfordshire was brigade support. 4th Seaforth Highlanders was in support of the supporting brigade even. And 5 and 7 Kings spent most of their time in the battle just digging. London Scottish and 9 Kings were Green Force, which weren't supposed to move forward until the 2 attacking brigades, which were divergent and thus created the gap. But the most successful TF formation at Lewes was the 47th Division. You might say it was one of the most successful divisions at Lewes, full stop. Barter, the GOC, had used the time before the battle to create a layout of replica trenches in the rear. The NCOs, the officers, had observed at the front. Everyone had walked and practiced over the replica trenches. The platoon commanders knew what they were supposed to do. It attacked in a thoroughly professional manner, and took the ground. It had the advantage of the land to some extent, certainly, but the infantry, the artillery, the communications of 47th Div had all done very, very well. It demonstrated, essentially, that with adequate and thoughtful preparation, the German front could be penetrated and held. Haig, he says, the division was much knocked about, but unlike the regular 28th, which had not proved equal to the task, said Haig, and the other regular divisions, which had made minimal progress, the two supporting new army formations and the partially successful 9th and 15th divisions had not done as well as the 47th, and the 47th had far lighter casualties as well. 46th Division, the other territorial one that's going to take part in Loos, of course, was not so fortunate. It attacked the Hohenzollern. It was not allowed to use the plan that it wanted to use. There were little opportunity for reconnaissance. There were no maps that were worthwhile. It was an absolute disaster. But what it proved to Haig was that it apparently convinced him that the episode demonstrated, quote, some territorial units still need training and discipline. Tell that to the 46th that was lying in front of the Hohenzollern. The other arms, well, very briefly, 5. I'm going to move on and just come to the conclusion. Modern British doctrine, army doctrine, deals with fighting power. That's central to what the army does today. And fighting power has 3 components. There's the conceptual, which is about the philosophy, the doctrine, the context of why we're fighting, and the character of the battle. I'll take the physical. The physical component is about the equipment, the sustainability, the manpower, and the training. And then there's the moral, which is about the ethical foundations, the moral cohesion, the bonding of units. You can apply those 3 components loosely to the Territorials in 1915. Territorials mostly did know why they were fighting, the context of the war. They didn't know anything about the character of the war other than it was going to be very bloody, which it turned out to be, of course. The moral component, as far as they were concerned, yes, they had cohesion, they had bonding. It might have been for king and country, but it was probably more to do with just their local cohesion from their regional identity, as it were. The physical, well, their manpower was kept deliberately in short supply. Their weaponry, the equipment, in other words, was also in short supply and antiquated. The sustainability, in other words, the logistics, as it were in the hands of other people. And their training had been patchy because they'd not had the opportunity to train properly with the right equipment before they'd been sent over. But why were they important in that case? Well, French knew what their importance was. He addressed many times how valuable they had been, particularly stopping the Germans coming down the coast in 1415. They were crucial. The field ambulances, the field companies and the battalions in helping to stem this German advance and to prop up, if you like, the regulars over that first winter of the war. In tactical terms, they probably achieved very little. But operationally, in other words, in the wider scheme of things, they were very important because it showed British commitment. You've got to send these territorials because they're an army in existence. That was why they were so important. They might not have been trained to the same standard, they didn't have the same equipment as the old regular army, but they were available. That's why they were sent across. That's why they did what they had to do. And it was the same with Gallipoli. 3 first-line territorial divisions are going to go over to join the 42nd, which was already there. What does that do? They were sent after, or the 2 of them were sent after 3 new army divisions had already been sent. That had shown resolve. Why not send the territorials first? Because again, the new armies perhaps are the blessed things. These are the ones, although they're earmarked for France, to show British resolve, send them to Gallipoli, and then send the remaining two first-line TF divs which are available. I've looked in vain through the war diaries for statements which say things like, we cannot entrust a territorial battalion to this task, or the Territorial Division next to us is not up to the job. You won't find that in war diaries. You will find implications, sentences which sort of suggest that perhaps we wouldn't want the Territorials to do that. But come 1916, of course, the Territorial Force reaches its apogee. At the beginning of the Somme, you will not find, or I cannot find, one conscript in any of those territorial divisions. The troops are there because they have volunteered deliberately to join the Territorial Force, as opposed to join the regulars or a new army. The Somme, of course, like so many other of the new army and regulars, they're torn apart, and it ceases to be, essentially, after then, I would argue, the Territorial Force. Thanks very much, ladies and gentlemen.